Hello, this is Richard Norman again. I decided that I would do a few more of these live interviews. Uh, it seems awfully narcissistic of me to talk about myself. That's not a good thing to do, is always talk about yourself, but many have asked some questions. And so I thought it good perhaps to tell a few stories about me myself. I was born on September the 15th, 1929. The next month, October, the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. It wasn't my fault. I didn't have anything to do with it. Oops, it just happened. Anyway, there are two ways that I can talk about that. I can tell you about the Great Depression if you're interested in that, or I can tell you about my earliest memories, and I think I'll start with my earliest memories. Most people don't remember back before they were 4 or 5 years old, but something happened in my life that uh, stuck in my mind very, very vividly, even today. Uh, and I was 3 years old. I was born in San Benito, Texas, which is right next door to Brownsville in the Rio Grande Valley. And when I was about 2.5 or 3, we had a huge hurricane blow through that area, destroying almost everything. In about 1932 or 3, somewhere in there, I can't remember exactly. But I remember standing on the couch in the living room where we lived with my uh, parents and my grandparents, uh, my mother's uh, parents. Their name was Waters. Luther Waters was my mother's father, and he was an incredibly big man. He had uh, hands like hams. They were so big. I remember after I married that my wife could put her hands splayed out and set it down in the palm of my grandfather's hand. That's how big his hands were. He was well over 6 feet, I'm sure. A very, very strong man. And he served as the chief of police in Brownsville, Texas at that time. But we lived in San Benito in a small wood frame house when the hurricane came, and I was standing on the couch in the living room and looking out. We had a picture window behind the couch, and I was looking out with my mother. She was standing there and looking outside at the wind blowing the trees. They'd just shake a little bit and stop, and then they'd shake a little bit and stop. And she knew that was a sign that a hurricane was coming. We did not have a TV, of course, and I'm not sure if we even had a radio then, and so there was no news to listen to. Anyway, when this thing blew in, It was really terrific. I could hear the wind howling outside, and it scared me very much. And at one point, it got so bad that my mother said that the wind had blown away part of the kitchen of the house, and the house was ready to go. And so we all got out, my mother and father and me and my baby brother, who was just an infant, barely could sit up at that time, and my grandparents. And we, Grandpa got the car around to the front. In those days, cars were great big things. You had to, they were what was called running boards on either side so that you could climb up into the car. That's the way they were made back in the 30s and 20s and 30s. And I remember that he picked up a 4x4 plank about 3 feet long and used that to wedge the door open because of the great wind blowing the door shut so that we could get into the car. I do remember that very vividly, that post wedging the door open. And after we got in, we started driving through water, and the water was up to the running boards of the car. That's about a foot deep in the street. And we drove for a ways, and then we went up on a kind of little hill. Texas is pretty flat, but there are little hills around, and we went up a little hill, and there was a brick house sitting on the top of that little hill, and we had some friends that lived there, and the brick house we felt like would withstand the storm. And so we moved in with those people. I don't remember who they are. I don't remember even seeing them. I'm sure I did, but there are very few things that I do remember at the age of 3. But I do remember being in that house. In those days, houses were made of wood. There was no such thing as sheetrock or even plywood. None of those things had been invented yet. So the wood in the house for the walls was uh, were planks, long planks, about an inch thick and about 8 inches wide, and the walls were built with those planks. And on those planks, they would paste some very thin gauze material onto those planks, and then over that, they would paste wallpaper on top of that. Every house was made that way in those days. Putting wallpaper on a wall like that with the gauze and then the wallpaper was a very specific skill that was required to be able to do that. But there were many people that were very skilled in doing that. Anyway, that also was true of the ceiling. It was also wood with those 1 inch planks and 8 inches wide, and the gauze and the ceiling paper. It was a little different kind of paper, but it was usually uh, white, uh, but the wallpaper had colors. You could have flowers or whatever you wanted. You could choose the color of wallpaper for each room, but the ceilings were always white, and they were pasted up there just like the walls. So that rain came sideways. Of course, it was the wind was horrific, well over 100 miles an hour, blowing that water out of the Gulf of Mexico into the Rio Grande Valley. And the water seeped under the roof, and it got on the ceiling and made it wet. And what that did, the water dripped through, and it caused some of that wallpaper to be come down in a kind of a bowl where the water was fixing to just break through. Well, the men of the house got a 6-foot ladder and an ice pick, and he got up there and punched holes in those little bulbs that came down with water, and they were all over the roof. Every room had them, and there were many of them. They were sometimes about 8 or 10 inches in diameter, and some of them were small. But anyway, they got every kind of container in the house, the women did, and brought them and put them under to let the water drip, and then they would carry that water out and throw it out. But they had to continually do that throughout the time, and consequently, the floors were all very wet. And I do remember that there was a strange hallway in that particular house, in the very center of the house, and it was about 4 foot square. And the rain did not affect that little 4 foot area in the ceiling in that hallway at all. And there were doors, 4 doors, going into that little square hallway of about 4 feet square. And that's where they set my little brother. And I remember seeing him sitting there in the center of that little hallway, just wearing a diaper. He didn't have anything else on but a diaper. He could barely sit up, and they put rugs, rolled quilts and rugs around, and laid them, stuffed them under the doorways so that water from the house couldn't roll into that little hallway, and my brother could sit where it was dry, sit on the floor that was dry that whole time. I do remember that. I remember our trip to that house. As we drove along, I remember seeing small garages, that were separate from the house, and the wind would take the side of one up, and then the roof would come up with it, and then it would just go over and blow away, and whatever was in the car, or there was, I remember seeing a little small pickup truck that blew over and began to roll. So I remember seeing all of that as I was 3 years old, when I was 3 years old. And after the rain had gone and the storm was over, the streets were flooded. And I do remember in those days, of course, everybody smoked cigarettes, everybody. And I remember seeing my Uncle Jack, who was about 6'2", 1 or 2, and built like a brick house. And I remember him in a pair of breeches without a shirt go out into that street, and the water was up almost to his chest as he kind of walked and halfway swam down that street to go to a store that was up on a little hill that was open, and he bought some cigarettes. You must really, really want to smoke to do stupid thing like that. uh, anyway, I do remember that. And it wasn't long that my family, my mother and father, and my little brother and I uh, packed ourselves into a very small coupe. It has one seat, and on the back they had a rumble seat that folded up, and you could sit back there, but it would be open. There would be no roof back there, and it was only about 3 feet wide, so not more than a couple of people could sit there in a rumble seat. But anyway, that we stuffed our clothes in that little compartment. What little we had, everything was gone, pretty much. And we began to drive from the Rio Grande Valley, from Brownsville, all the way up to Austin, Texas, which is in the very center of the state. And it was the state capital. And so my grandfather on my father's side, the Normans, lived in Austin. My grandfather was a preacher for the Church of Christ, and he had established 2 congregations in the city himself from scratch, one on the south side of the city and one on the north side of the city. And I'll tell you about him in just a minute. But I want to tell you about that road. It was not even paved all the way. There were sections of it that had a little asphalt, but the road was narrow, only one lane in each direction, one lane going north and one lane going south. And and there was not much traffic on it at all, I don't guess. But anyway, we drove that long distance. Now, I do not remember much about that travel time at all, but I'm sure it took a great deal of time because it was almost 500 miles, I guess, from Brownsville to Austin, Texas. And on that little road, and much of it was just a gravel road. But anyway, that was the way it was back in my early days. I did tell you that I was born the month before the Great Depression began. And after we moved to Austin, I remember many things about the Great Depression. And I can look back on it now and tell you some of the terrible things about the Great Depression. But I'll tell you this, it didn't affect me personally in the least. I paid absolutely no attention to it. I was just a little kid. And I want you to know that I had the happiest childhood a kid could possibly have. I was loved by my parents. They were good parents. My grandparents loved me, and we all lived together for 13 years in my grandfather's home in Austin, Texas. I remember we called them tramps, people who were homeless and ragged, had nothing. They would come to the house and offer to do some kind of little chore job around the house or the yard or something just for a meal. And I remember not one of them was ever turned away. My mother always could fix a meal. And I remember many different men sitting out on the back steps of the house with a plate of food and eating a meal that my mother had prepared for them. People lost everything. My father told me, I had no idea, and he told me many years later that he had started out as a banker, but the banks closed. FDR closed the banks for a while, and my father was out of work, and he said he had to dig ditches to make 50 cents a day. He was a little bitty man. He was about 5'6" and probably weighed no more than 100 pounds. Very, very skinny little man. And I can't imagine him doing hard labor, digging ditches for 50 cents a day. It was a terrible, terrible time for people. People were starving. Now, of course, if you look and do a little research, you can see there were bread lines and there were all kinds of things to help the poor. And it was really terrible. But it didn't affect me at all. And I'll tell you why. My grandfather on my mother's side was named Luther Waters. My grandfather on my father's side was named Luther Norman. And my grandfather had a big, fine house. It was only one story, but it was I think it had 4 bedrooms, only 1 bath, and it was very small indoors. And but it was a very nice house. The rooms were big in the house. And if you wonder why he could have such a house, I found out many years later that he was an agent for the Kansas City Life Insurance Company. And he sold life insurance for a living. And people bought life insurance in those days. They might not be able to find food or whatever, but almost everybody had felt like they had to have life insurance. And so he did very well. He was very successful. He had an office in a downtown high-rise building, and a secretary and agents that worked with him and for him. And he drove a big, fine car. He bought one about every 2 years. And my grandmother, her name was Alma. She was an invalid. She was sick most of her life, and I remember her being bedridden. There were times when she'd get up and stir around and do things and dress and everything. But there were many times when she just couldn't get out of bed at all. And so my grandfather hired a maid. He had that kind of money to do that. They were usually white ladies who were of some foreign descent, like from Poland or Germany or somewhere. And they had an accent. Now, I remember one had a French accent, but she was not from France. She was a Cajun from Louisiana. And she worked for us for a while to help with my grandmother and to help with the housekeeping and the wash and everything that was done. This was way before there were washing machines. Uh, to wash clothes, you had to have a tub. They were big. Some of them were, they were three sizes you could buy. A small tub was about a foot and a half wide in diameter. And the next one was about 2 feet. And then the third one was about 3 feet. And so they were called number one wash tub, number two wash tub, and number three wash tub. Well, I remember my mother washing clothes on a tub. She'd have to boil water, put in, and she had to make soap. They made lye soap, and they washed clothes with lye soap in a big tub like that. And to wash on, there was a little board about so high, and it had a tin on it that was very rippled. So you rub on that rub board to get the clothes clean. And you just scrub and scrub and scrub and get those clean. Then you'd wring them out and set them aside. And when you were done, you would rinse them out with clear water, rinse the soap out of them, wring them out by hand, set them aside. And when you were done rinsing all the clothes, you'd have to take a big basket full of clothes outside. And we had clotheslines all over the backyard, probably 6 or 8 of them, long clotheslines, many, many clothespins. They came in a big bag, and you would have to hang the clothes out to dry on those clotheslines. Everything had to be hung up on those clotheslines to dry. It took a while for the wind to do that. But I'll tell you that if you have never slept on fresh washed sheets that were hung on a line to dry, you have really missed a treat. Those sheets felt so wonderful, fresh, and they smelled so good. You can't imagine how wonderful that was in those days. But that's a little bit about that. My grandfather was also a preacher. He had established 2 churches of Christ in Austin, one on the north side and one on the south side. And when we moved up there, and I was about 4 by the time I got there, and from then on, my memory is very, very clear from that point on. But my grandfather was a very big, heavy-set man, very fat, but he was the most jovial, happy-go-lucky man you would ever want to meet. He was always full of fun and laughter and joy. He felt joyful every day, no matter what went on. He loved to sing, and he had a very, very good voice, big, big, booming voice. And he would preach every Sunday, and he didn't care whether the church paid him anything or not, because he made his living in other ways. But if you ask him what he did for a living, he would say, "I'm a gospel preacher." And I always thought that that's the way he made his living. Until later on, I was almost a teenager before I realized he made his living a different way and didn't care whether he was paid or not by a church. but he gave his life fully to that work. In his lifetime, I think he probably established around 100 churches of Christ around the central Texas. There are many, many congregations that he established from scratch in many small communities around the central Texas. But he was best known for his singing ability. We had in those days what we call gospel meetings, where a preacher would come in, a guest preacher would come in and spend at least 2, maybe 3 weeks preaching day and night every day for 2 or 3 weeks. And you might be surprised that people came in droves to listen to those men preach. And those gospel meetings, sometimes the church buildings were not large enough for the crowds because other churches would come to attend our meetings when we had them, and we would go visit their church when they had a meeting like this. And so I heard gospel preaching weeks at a time all through my early years of growing up. I heard hundreds and hundreds of sermons, lessons, Bible classes, and the like as I grew up. And every day around 2 or 3 o'clock, I don't remember when, I would be called in to visit with my grandmother who was in bed. And she would have me sit down by her bed and she would read the Bible to me every day. She read so many stories of the Old Testament that I love to hear. I love to hear her read the Bible to me. And so I heard a great deal of preaching. My father was also able to preach, but he was more of a teacher than a preacher. But he was very, very active in the church. A week after I was born, my mother took me to church, and I have hardly missed a service, Sunday morning, Sunday night, or Wednesday night, since I was a week old. And today, at 93, I never miss Sunday morning, Sunday night, or Wednesday night going to church. The church I attend is fairly large. It has around between 500 and 600 members. And they have a bus that comes and picks us up from this facility for each of those services. So I still attend services regularly. Now, as I was saying, my grandfather was most noted as a singer. And when people had gospel meetings, he was probably the most popular man to come and lead the congregation in singing. In Churches of Christ, we do not use instrumental music. Instrumental music didn't come into Christianity for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so the early church did not use instrumental music. I think it first came in around 300 into a Catholic church. The Pope raged against it, and and uh, it was forbidden for a while. But after about 1,000 years, uh, instrumental music became commonplace in various denominations. The Churches of Christ have never used them, and neither has the Greek Orthodox Church ever used them. And you might be interested to know that the word a cappella, which is Latin, literally means as in the churches. So if you sing a cappella, you sing without instrumental music. That's the very meaning of the word. And so that's why we don't use it. It's not really actually authorized by the scriptures for the church. It was used in the Old Testament, and it was used in other religions through the years, but not after Acts 2 was it ever used for about 1,000 years, at least regularly. Anyway, my grandfather had a big, powerful voice, and when they had gospel meetings, and sometimes they were outdoors, his voice was so big that without a microphone, we didn't have microphones in churches back then. He had to speak loud enough that everybody could hear. He had to sing loud enough that he could lead a congregation of hundreds of people in doing that. Well, my grandfather, when I was age 4, when he would come home from work in the evening, he would greet me with a hug and lift me up and stand me on the dining table and ask me to sing him a song. And he'd sing with me and I'd sing. Probably couldn't carry a tune, but he began to teach me how to sing. And he could teach what we called singing schools for the Churches of Christ, teach people how to read the shaped notes, solfege. He knew what each shape meant and what it sounded like in the bass, the tenor, the alto, and the soprano. And he would teach congregations how to read that music and train them to sing different parts a cappella. And I attended dozens of those singing schools. And I learned it so well that by the time I was a teenager, I could teach those kind of classes. I could read music. By the time I was 12, I could read any piece of music you handed me. Just sight read it. Never seen it before. Sing it by reading the notes. And I've been able to read notes like that and still can and still do. On some of the newer songs that are coming into the churches nowadays, I've never seen them before or heard them, but I can sight read them and sing along just like everybody else. Anyway, he taught me how to sing. He taught me how to read music. And by the time I was 12, I was pretty proficient. And by the time I was 16 years of age, the church we attended in Austin, Northside Church, had grown to more than 500 members. We had a nice big building, and I was hired by the church leaders to be the regular song director for the congregation at every service, including gospel meetings. And I was paid by the church $10 a week. In 1946, $10 a week was very good money. When I married in 1949, I worked in a bank and I only made $90 a month. So I was paid very well. I think next time, let's see. Next time I want to talk with you, I'm going to tell you about my music, the music in my life. Music will be my next subject. I've already started it a little bit, but I wanted you to know these things. And, I'd said a live chat, but I don't hear. I wore my headphones so I'd hear any questions that were asked or comments, but I don't hear any, so maybe I didn't do it right. But anyway, thank you for listening today. Goodbye and God bless.